funding mechanism to help restore the Great Lakes. It's focused on areas of concern and other activities that will lead to restoration of areas of the Great Lakes. And we were fortunate enough to start getting money under GLRI, I think around 2010, I want to say. And it was with that money that we were able to fund the Phase 1 St. Louis River TMDL study. Unfortunately, when that work came to an end, we did not have additional funding to continue that process. We recently got wind of some potential money that we were trying to secure to do a sediment resuspension study that Sheree and I think Nancy mentioned earlier. So we're hoping to move that project forward in the direction of the TMDL down the road.
Okay, we've got a number of good questions. I think we're going to go right into the questions so we don't run out of time for questions. I wish we had time for all of these. So I'll ask a question and then I'll let, you can raise your hand, I guess, if that's one that you want to dive into. Okay, this one probably goes to Shannon. Why is the PCA resistant to controlling sulfate pollution from mining facilities in the St. Louis River watershed?
So I don't think it's accurate to say that we're resistant to controlling sulfate. I think what is the case is that we don't have the science yet to determine if we need to control sulfate to address the mercury problem, and then to what extent we would need to control sulfate. And that's why we're doing the work that we're doing, to really understand the drivers and the factors that are playing into the mercury methylation issue. I understand that a lot of people think that sulfate is the smoking gun and that's what needs to occur, but we just don't have the science yet that needs to establish that. And we want to make sure that we get this right. It's very important to have that scientific understanding so that we know what we need to focus on and we can actually solve the problem. Otherwise, we're going to end up wasting a lot of time and a lot of resources and maybe not have a solution at the end. And that's not acceptable or responsible because we want to solve the problem.
You know, this question goes a little bit further than that. It's not just about the mercury, it's also about wild rice. It's about those permits that are 20 years old that you don't seem to be able to get around to doing. And I think everyone in this room knows that it's because you are reluctant to require the mining industry to control their sulfates.
Okay, Minnesota has been involved in mercury reduction for 2 decades. Has the amount of mercury in the fish that comes out of the river been reduced? You want to dive into that one?
All I know is that we have some data on mercury levels in fish in the part of the river that runs by the Fond du Lac Reservation. We haven't seen a reduction in mercury concentrations in those fish, but I would also say we haven't been looking at it long enough to see what some of the long-term changes are. It's not going to happen overnight. Reductions that happened 10 years ago are the reductions in emissions from 10 years ago are the reductions we're going to begin to see in the fish, hopefully. So some of the work that's already happened is going to take a while to be reflected. And so I think there are probably some scientists in the room here tonight that have an idea of how they would answer this question, but they probably wouldn't give you a definitive yes, and more data is needed.
Okay, anybody else want to tackle that one, or is that? Sounds like not. Okay. My concern is the wild rice and sulfites. Tell me that legislators are going to be in tune to the need for better control. That's an interesting question. Anybody want? You want to try that one?
Well, actually, I think that's a question for legislators. That's not a question that I can answer. I'm part of working on understanding sulfate in wild rice, but I can't speak for other people.
Okay, this one is for Nancy. Please explain the differences between the state water quality standards and the tribal water quality standards.
Well, the major differences lie in how we define our designated or beneficial uses, those priorities, the resources that are important to the band. For instance, we have a wild rice use, and we have standards that protect the growth and the sustainability of healthy stands of wild rice. As far as the numeric criteria, where we're different from the state is that we assume that band members are in general eating more fish than the general public, and so our mercury and other contaminant criteria need to be lower for our ability to meet that water quality standards that's related to eating fish. And so, for instance, our mercury standard is half of what the state's water quality standard is in the Lake Superior Basin, and the state standard in the Lake Superior Basin is substantially lower than it is for the rest of the state. That reflects some of those concerns that are shared across the Great Lakes to not only protect human health, but to protect wildlife. The last place where we are different with water quality standards, you have designated uses, you have criteria, and you have anti-degradation. Anti-degradation is that philosophy of we're not going to let our high-quality waters be degraded. We're not going to let them water quality be lowered so we're just barely meeting standards. We're going to protect those high-quality waters. And the best quality waters that we have on the reservation, by definition, at the time that the Fond du Lac Preservation Business Committee adopted our standards, immediately instituted those top protections for the wild rice waters on the Fond du Lac Reservation, those Tier 3 waters where we don't allow any degradation of water quality.
Okay, how can we consider permitting a sulfide mine such as Polymet, considering the existing mercury problem in the St. Louis River watershed? I think Shan's question.
Any permit that the Pollution Control Agency issues for any facility needs to meet our water quality standards. So any permit that we would issue for a Polymet project or a project like that needs to be consistent with both the statewide TMDL, and it also needs to meet the water quality standards. So those are the requirements that we look at and that we evaluate when we're issuing permits, and that's how we would evaluate a project like Polymet or any other kind of project that comes along.
Shannon, would the PCA also state that you have the same responsibility to make sure that the permit would meet the water quality standards of downstream states? I mean, the law requires that, but I've never actually heard that articulated by the Minnesota state government.
So the question was, a paraphrase of the question is, when we're looking at issuing permits, do we consider the need to meet the protection levels for downstream waters? And we definitely look at that. Part of our review is looking at ensuring protection of downstream waters as well.
And that's actually what I wanted to at least make a comment regarding. We are really concerned about the expansion of mining that's happening upstream of the reservation. And what we've seen with the way that it's being permitted, and not just by Shannon's agency, but by the DNR, by federal agencies, is that we're not convinced that it is taking all of the available information into account when decisions are being made. And in fact, we don't believe that some of the permits that have been issued recently or that are in draft stage right now are actually going to be protective of our downstream water resources. So this is an issue where we are continuing to have dialogue with the EPA and with the state agencies, because I think at the end of the day, we do all share a goal of healthy waters. and water resources, and I'm hopeful that we can find a way to make that happen through the permitting process too.
Got a question here. Skip Sandman, running from the 8th Congressional District here. I got a question. How much pressure are the corporations putting on MCPA, EPA to expedite those petitions for the mining? And what is the state doing to counteract that, if any? You got to get the money out of politics, okay, from my point of view.
I think
You need to get that out.
that's a good question, probably difficult for these folks to answer. That happens at higher levels than they're probably working, I would suspect. But that's a problem. This is a good question for our medical person, so I'm going to ask her to come up. The question is, what do we know about the demographics of the 10% of babies being born with high mercury levels in the Lake Superior Basin?
So this was a large study done in the Lake Superior Basin, and babies in the Minnesota side and the Michigan side and Wisconsin side, there were over 1,000 samples taken. And demographics were basically people that lived in the Lake Superior Basin. In terms of how that was broken down, I don't have the data for that to really give you. But it was found, interestingly, that those in the Minnesota side were higher than the other areas. And I think further studies do need to be done on that to look at demographics. But that's what I have.
Well, I think at this point I'd like to ask the question I was thinking of asking, and that is, how can we as citizens, as environmental organizations, what can we do to help move this process forward? Anybody want to take a crack at that?
I think I've heard the answer from a number of people already tonight, which is, you know, your interest, your activism, your showing up for things like this. Because if you aren't here, we won't be here either. So, you know, be nice to us, we're people too, but hold us accountable, certainly. Anybody else?
I would just further echo Peter's comments and point out that, you know, some of the questions that you asked had to do with permits and how do permits work and what are the decisions that are being made around permits. And I do want to point out that permitting activities happen in a public process. They require public notice. There's information that is put out on public notice, and there's a comment process that goes along with that as well. And I really encourage you to look at that information and provide comments. I know on the PolyNet project, there's a lot of comments that were provided on the supplemental environmental impact statement. And the states and the partners that are involved in doing that environmental impact statement need to go through all of those comments and respond to them and consider them. And I know from the work that I do in adopting water quality standards that those comments really do matter. We learn things that we didn't know before. There are things that you know about your community and about what's happening in your community that's helpful information that helps inform the work that we're doing and helps us also understand how to be good partners and how to continue to facilitate that local community work that Nancy was talking about, and then also to ensure that we're doing a good job at the state level. You know, you're part of holding us accountable, as Peter said, and we really do welcome that participation.
And I would also urge you to make sure that this issue is on the front burner, both with your elected officials. They need to hear from you, not just from industry. And the local media, it's really helpful if ordinary citizens, and I put air quotes around that term because I know that a lot of people in this room are really well educated on this topic. You guys know a lot about this issue in this place, and you're as articulate as anybody else in expressing what is important to you. And to put that on an opinion page is really helpful. It helps counteract some of the misinformation and the somewhat misguided opinions that sometimes get published. But I guess I'm mostly intrigued by an idea that I think was raised towards the end of the previous panel about MEP or some organization or affiliation of organizations holding an annual forum on this event. It's one of my sins of omission that our partnership in the 3 years that we were working previously on the TMDL study, we never did have a public meeting. And we should have. We kept waiting until we felt that we had enough information or a path forward to bring to the public to gather input, because I know there's a lot of concern and interest and awareness and knowledge out there that needs to be fed into this process.
I'd like to make one other plug too, and that is I think we're the beneficiaries of a federal program that we didn't have a few years ago, and that's the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We benefit greatly. And programs like that don't happen without people supporting them. So without too much further ado, and I don't want to get into hot water for lobbying, but I just want to say that public support for those kind of programs that really support the efforts to clean up areas and to find solutions to environmental problems are really important.
I've got one last thing to add, and it builds on to what Nancy had said. We are just starting to get some of the results back from the research that's been going on, and I think it's going to be critical for us to be able to share that with all of you and be open and transparent. So I completely support a public forum. These are extremely complex issues. It isn't just one source. There's several sources, and I think we're going to need to communicate that with folks so we can bring you along as we're learning and decide what the best tools are. Thanks.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking our panel here for giving us I was just going to say we're going to give you a 5-minute break now, and then we'll reconvene.